The date is the 17th of July 1918, and as the clock strikes 2 a.m., Tsar Nicholas II and his family are woken from their beds. The Romanov family has held power for years across the Russian Empire, but tonight that empire will fall and a new Soviet state will arise in its place. First, though, the Bolshevik revolutionaries have one piece of unfinished business. The Romanov family is led downstairs into a basement room of the mansion they're being held prisoner in. Their guards claim that the move is for their protection. Anti-Bolshevik forces are moving in on the house, and the family could get caught in the crossfire. As the family enters the small basement room, the former Tsarina Alexandra complains that there are no chairs for them to sit in. One of the Bolshevik guards signals, and a firing squad files into the room. The man in command of the death squad, Yakov Yurovsky, announces that the Ural Soviet of Workers' Deputies has decided the Tsar and his family will be executed for crimes against the nation. A stunned Nicholas yells out, "You know not what you do," and turns to his family. With the command, the firing squad opens up. The Tsar falls to the ground, dead from several bullets through his torso. His wife and daughters are wounded, but incredibly are protected by the diamonds and precious gems sewn into their fancy clothes. The executioners close in and use bayonets and gunshots to the head to finish off the last of the Tsar's family. The Empire of Russia is no more, and the United Socialist Soviet Republic is born. As the Tsarina lay dying, she can't help but wonder, how did a system built on the brutal exploitation of the working class go so horribly wrong? Rewind back to 1914, and World War I has just broken out. For Tsar Nicholas II, the outbreak of the war is in itself a bit of a lucky break. For over a decade now, the Russian people have been discontent, clamoring for a workers' revolution. In 1905, immediately following the defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, a full-blown revolution broke out with mass mutinies by the military and workers' strikes across the empire. In a bid to avoid having his empire collapse from underneath him, Tsar Nicholas II agreed reluctantly to several compromises in a bid to appease the masses. In an unprecedented turn of events, the Tsar agreed to share his power with parliament elected by the people. Well, sort of. The Russian Constitution of 1906 would end up creating a bicameral or two-house parliament. The upper house, known as the State Council, was appointed directly by the Tsar, which is a suspiciously undemocratic way of doing things in our book. The lower house, or the State Duma, was made up of members that were elected by government, clerical, and even commercial parties, and the election process was indirect and complex, so as to ensure that the wealthy and influential could control exactly who ended up in the State Duma. The new constitution also gave the parliament the right to question the Tsar's various ministers. Although it had no power to appoint or dismiss them, only the Tsar himself could do that. The parliament could also not alter the constitution unless the Tsar initiated any such change, and the Tsar retained the right to veto any legislation the parliament drew up, without any need to offer a reason for doing so. The Russian people were initially ecstatic. For about exactly 2 minutes, which is how long it took everyone to realize that the new parliament was A, controlled either by the Tsar directly, who could appoint the upper house, or by the rich and elite in society who manipulated elections to elect the lower house, and also B, that the parliament in essence had absolutely no power unless the Tsar approved it, and the Tsar could simply veto anything the parliament decided to do if he felt like it. Things in the Russian Empire suddenly seemed a lot less optimistic and a lot more like the same old BS, just a different flavor. Over the next several years, resentment toward the Tsar once more continued to grow, as the people realized that they had once more gotten themselves what is scientifically known as a raw deal. The parliament they had fought so hard to create was now half-staffed by Tsar loyalists, and the other half handpicked by members of the wealthy elite, and neither side could do much of anything even if it wanted to without the Tsar approving. If history has taught us anything, it's that Russians are nothing if not determined, and soon the flames of revolution were once more spreading. Then in 1914, despite the fact that a whole lot of people in Sarajevo wanted him dead, Archduke Ferdinand decided to go for a ride through the city with his top down. Within a month, the complex system of alliances that bound Europe together had resulted in a détente between two major coalitions: France, Russia, and Britain, known as the Triple Entente, and Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, known as the Triple Alliance. Austria-Hungary had demanded impossible considerations from Serbia over the Archduke's death in order to avoid a full-blown war, and Russia felt the need to back Serbia up. On the 30th of July, just 2 days after Austrian-Hungarian forces shelled the capital of Serbia, Tsar Nicholas II ordered a full mobilization of his empire for war. Germany immediately demanded that Russia demobilize its troops within 12 hours, and when Russia refused, Germany went on and did a silly thing, launching the first of 2 world wars it would fight and lose in the same century. The outbreak of war was great for the Tsar. as a wave of patriotism swept across the population of the Russian Empire. This was much to the chagrin of the Bolsheviks, who had earned the support of nearly 80% of the working class in their bid for revolution. Driven underground by patriotic fervor, the Bolsheviks were forced to delay their planned revolution against the Tsar, even as they worked to educate the people as to the folly of fighting what they called the Tsar's War. Russian patriotic fervor quickly began to die, though, and Russia suffered terrible defeat after terrible defeat on the battlefields of Europe. Tsar Nicholas II had hoped that if Russia could score key victories in the war, it would reverse the shame and bitterness over the empire's previous defeat against Japan 10 years ago, and perhaps quell some of the revolutionary fervor. Soon, though, it became clear that Russian forces were performing exceptionally poorly on the Eastern Front, and encouraged by the enigmatic monk Grigory Rasputin, the Tsar departed to lead his forces from the front. If he could personally lead his troops to victory, surely the people would accept him as their ruler. The Tsar had firmly hitched his star to the performance of the Russian military, and the military would disappoint dramatically. To make matters worse, though, the entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war would cut off major Russian trade routes, helping to spur the nation along into an economic crisis. Now, not only were the troops performing poorly on the Eastern Front, threatening all-out defeat at any time, but back home in Russia, the economy had all but collapsed. In order to fund the war, the government had printed millions of rubles, which in turn led to hyperinflation, which saw prices as high as 4 times normal by 1917. The farmers, who now faced the prospect of selling their grain at a steep loss, decided to hoard much of their grain and instead only grow enough to feed themselves. This directly led to starvation in cities and further skyrocketed prices. As morale collapsed amongst Russian troops, workers in the cities also began to grow restless. They demanded higher wages in order to cover the higher costs brought on by inflation and scarcity. Germany secretly fed funds to Russian revolutionaries, who, with the aid of massive propaganda campaigns, successfully launched workers' strikes across the empire. Even with the parliament that the Tsar had firmly in his pocket, there were calls for revolution, sort of. The lower house began to call for the forming of a new government which could better handle the economic crisis and the war, which was itself quickly turning into a crisis. The Tsar rejected their calls outright, refusing to even hear of having his power replaced in any shape or form. The conscription of approximately 15 million peasants to the army also had an unexpected effect which would turn out to be very detrimental to the continued rule and life of the Tsar. Drawing together citizens from all over the empire, the conscripts were quickly united by their terrible conditions on the front line and spoke together of revolution at home. The war had become extremely unpopular, especially amongst those fighting and losing it, and yet the soldiers didn't want to simply return back to their old lives. Nicholas II's failures in the war had fed a deep resentment amongst the millions of peasants now bonded through the camaraderie of military service on the front lines, and petty differences were put aside for a common belief in revolution. By 1916, a plot amongst senior army officers had already been considered to remove the Tsar from power. Shortly after, the infamous Mad Monk and confidant to the Tsar and Tsarina Rasputin was killed, and then massive worker strikes shook the empire. Incredibly, the Bolsheviks had actually tried to stop the strikes, believing that the time for revolution was not yet right. But the Russian people would not be stopped, and by the end of February, the police and military were being called in to suppress the strikes. As soldiers defected and joined with the civilians, giving them access to armories full of weapons, the president of the Duma, Mikhail Rodzianko, sent a telegram to the Tsar, warning him the situation is becoming worse. Measures must be taken immediately, for tomorrow will be too late. Upon receipt of the telegram, the Tsar infamously remarked, "Once again, the fat-bellied Rodzianko has written me a lot of nonsense, which I won't even bother to answer." The next day, the Tsar boarded a train to head for home after telegraphing his wife. But the Tsar's train would be rerouted by rail workers and then blocked. The 1,000-year rule of the Tsars was over. The root causes of the revolution can be boiled down to a deep discontentment amongst the increasingly disenfranchised working classes of the Russian Empire. In the cities, workers were expected to do 10 to 12-hour workdays 6 days a week for poor pay, under extremely poor safety and sanitary conditions. Workers could not just be fined for making mistakes on the job, but they could even be beaten by their foremen as punishment. Farmers didn't have it much better. In 1861, the peasants were liberated from serfdom and their feudal obligations to the nobles. Tsar Alexander II forced the nobility to give up parts of their lands and gave them directly to the people. Yet, they would not truly own this land, as they would now have to make payments directly to the government. In essence, while free from their serfdom, Russian peasants were now permanently indebted to the Tsar. It was a condition sort of like taxes, except they had to pay those too. But hey, what better way for the poor peasants to show their adoration for the Tsar that liberated them from serfdom by making them owe the government forever? This is what passed for a good idea in the Russian Empire. Growing inequality, which mirrors today's growing wealth gap, also fueled the revolution and downfall of the Tsars. By the 20th century, 25% of the land was owned by the wealthiest 1.5% of the Russian nobility. With a disastrous war and a crumbling economy adding fuel to the fire, the downfall of the Tsars was inevitable. And this time, no half measure would secure even a temporary tenebrous peace. Alright, comrade, now that you've gotten through this video, we think that for the cause of the revolution, you should check out this other video too. Or maybe you prefer this one here instead? Either way, unlike the Russian Revolution, we guarantee you our vids aren't full of Bolshevik. So click one now.